I read this book quite a while ago, relatively. It's been a couple of years, I guess. Maybe not, it seems like quite a while ago. It was fascinating. And, I don't know if I'd call them complex kids, but maybe all kids are complicated in a way. So 2 of my daughters have ADHD. One of them is trans. They've all kind of gone their own way and they're all reasonably successful, some more than others. But yeah, it's like herding cats. And I think I learned pretty early on, unlike my father, you just can't channel them, right? You just have to guide them and help them and let them find their own way.
Well, that's really what it's about, is empowering them to find their own way, is to help them understand themselves well enough to want to learn to manage themselves. Yeah, whatever that means for them.
One of the first things that I'm really interested in is, a lot of times I speak to an author who's written a book, and it's almost like they had this book inside of them and it just had to come out, right? There was some reason, something they were trying to accomplish in the world, some knowledge they wanted to impart. So how was that experience for you?
It's a great description. I remember when I was going through near the end of publishing this book, I remember saying to my husband, I'm terrified I'm going to die with a song still in me. Like, it was so important. And I had written other books, but this book, so it's The Essential Guide to Raising Complex Kids with ADHD, Anxiety, and More. And I wrote it because I needed it, and it wasn't there when I had needed it. And when my kids were little, I was, reading all the parenting books, and none of it was working, and none of it was applying to my complex kids. And I read this one lovely parenting book that I really loved called The Blessings of a Skinned Knee by Wendy Mogul. And I got to hear her speak. And I'm sitting in this auditorium, and she's speaking, and she's doing the Q&A at the end. And she's been talking about accountability, and I'm getting a little upset. And I raise my hand gingerly and I say, what if your kid has special needs? And she looked at me straight on, Rick, and she said, well, then this doesn't apply to you. And I remember I was stunned, and then I start crying, and I'm still sitting there. The whole audience, the auditorium files out, and I'm still sitting there stunned. Like, well, if this doesn't apply to me, what does? And on the one hand, it was really hard because I felt lost. But on the other hand, it gave me permission to say, well, if this doesn't apply to me because my kids are complex, then it also gave me permission to parent differently and to think differently and to look for different resources and to not try to do it the way the parenting books told me to do it, because it wasn't working. And to accept that just because they gave me a reward chart didn't mean it was going to work for my kid or my family or for me as an adult with ADD. I don't think I knew it at the time. And so when I discovered coaching, and I discovered this unbelievable paradigm for parenting, because when I became a coach, I became a much better parent, and it was not on purpose, and it wasn't rocket science. It just applied so well to how I was connecting and collaborating with my complex kids. And so I really wanted to bring the coach approach to parents. I wanted to teach these coaching skills to other parents so that they could have the kinds of relationships with their kids that I had learned to have with mine. And my husband and I, because he became a coach as well, had learned to shift the way that we were interacting with our kids in a way that was empowering them. It's kind of what I was saying earlier, to take agency for themselves and to start wanting for them more than I was wanting from them. Because kids feel it when you want for them, and they feel it when you want from them. And so that's really, for me, it was about, I'd had this epiphanous transformational change in my life and my relationships with my kids that turned out to be phenomenal for my kids. And I wanted that for other parents. I didn't want other parents to feel as lost as I did. And I didn't want kids to grow up feeling as broken as I did.
I find that fascinating, because I think that, I know we all know a lot of these difficulties are intergenerational, and we parent the way we were parented, and it can go back many generations sometimes. So I think it's really a good way to kind of get out of that envelope some way and do something a little bit different than that happened with you.
Well, and it's interesting when you say that. I was parented with a lot of love, particularly from my mom and my grandparents. So and I often say love is not enough. Like, positive parenting is great for our complex kids, but it's not enough. Because if you, no matter how positive and loving you are, if you don't understand how this kid is wired and meet them where they are and help them understand how they're wired and how it's different, then no amount of love is going to help them learn to manage themselves or to navigate the complexities of life. So there's positive parenting, which is essential. Plus, we also have to understand the brain and the role that it plays. And we have to understand how to set expectations to meet their kids where they are, and how to use systems in a way that work really effectively for these kids. And those are the sections that we talk about in our model, in our book, and in this book. And I told you that we have a discussion guide. Actually, when I created the book, I wrote a discussion guide for people to talk through the different sections of the book to understand how do you apply this and how is it different from kind of typical parenting paradigms.
Yeah, I want to get to that discussion guide, but first, something else came up for me, I think a lot of parenting problems are based on the parents' insecurity themselves. Because they're afraid for their kid, and it sometimes comes out. They love their child, but it comes out more in a disciplinary kind of thing. You have to go in your room and do your homework for the next 5 hours because you're going to fail a class. So is that partly what this book does, is give parents kind of a roadmap in a way so they can be a little more secure about raising their child?
I think so. I think, two things come up as I hear you say that. One is, as parents, we're really attached. We're fiercely attached to the outcome. But we're so attached to the outcome that can really get in the way when our kids have issues like ADHD and other complex issues, because that requires a focus on process. And so to manage ADD means I need to manage the process of what happens when my brain gets distracted or impulsive or unfocused. I have to have an awareness and understanding of it, and then begin to put approaches in place to manage it. So it's all about process. If I'm only being held accountable to the outcome, did you get an A on that test? But I'm not being held accountable to the process. Are you studying 3 times, 4 times before that test? Then we can hold them accountable to the outcome, but they may not know how to achieve it. If we get into the process with them, we can support them. And so I think that's the biggest shift from a parenting perspective, is that we have to stop only being attached to what do they achieve. Or, I remember coaching a mom, this is a long time ago, and she had a 12-year-old kid and a 24-year-old young adult who had launched, but the 12-year-old had ADHD. And she was very frustrated because what she was doing with the first kid wasn't working with the second kid. And we had this conversation where she was kind of freaking out because the 12-year-old was leaving crumbs on the floor from eating potato chips in front of a television. And she was sure that meant this kid would never be able to take care of her apartment when she was 24. And so she was catastrophizing forward and then holding the kid accountable now to where she wanted her to be later, instead of working through the process of how do you help her become aware of the fact that she's leaving chips on the floor. Yeah. So it's just one example.
This is a tangent, I'm sure, but I think it's really important when parents, they're very other motivated somehow. I don't know how I would say that, but they get embarrassed and they get ashamed when they're out in public, with how does a parent deal with that?
So that's a part of what we're talking about here that we're not saying overtly is the distinction between their agenda and our agenda, right? When I'm out in public and I'm in a grocery store and my kid starts melting down because I said no to the chocolate bar, I'm starting to think, I'm no longer thinking about my kid. Now I'm thinking about people are looking at me and how do I appear as a parent? And do I appear too strict, or do I appear too lax, and now I'm worrying about me. If I'm worrying about me, I'm no longer paying attention to the fact that my kid's having a really hard time self-regulating right now. And this is hard for them to handle. And so if I let go of how people are looking at me, I can be present to my kid and say, wow, this is really hard for you right now. Instead of indulging the tantrum, giving them the candy bar and coming back later to deal with the kid who now has learned how to get what they want by throwing a tantrum. So it's that we as parents are constantly navigating, when is it about them and when is it about us? And I think we get into trouble when we make it too much about us without recognizing that there's this other being with their own agency in the mix, and we have to respect their agency as well. And that's hard for us to do because, as you say, it's not how a lot of us were parented.
Wow, that's fascinating. And I think it's kind of our ADHD mind, but I just drew a parallel between that and public speaking, because people are afraid to public speak because their ego is there. They're up on stage and they're talking, and it's all about them. What are these people thinking? And they can't be a good public speaker while it's about them. But
Right.
when they stand up there and say, I have a message to convey that's going to be helpful to these people, that's why they came here, and it's not about me at all, then all the ego kind of flows away. And the goal here is to be a good parent, to be a good speaker. I see
Right.
a very definite parallel between us.
I'm with you. And it goes back to what I was saying a little while ago, which is that it's a very nuanced distinction between wanting for them. If I can want for them, whether it's my audience or my kids, if I can, or my community, if I want for them more than I want from them, then I can be over there and be supportive of them. If I'm wanting from them more, then I'm over here. Somehow it's about me. And we have one of the tools we teach is called Q-tip, quit taking it personally.
Oh, cool.
And we have this tendency to make it about us when it's really not about us. And so there's another parenting expert guy named Hal Runkle who wrote Scream Free Parenting. And he tells the example of when we start screaming at our kids, what we're really saying to them is calm me down, make me okay by changing your behavior. Yeah. And so we've got to take ourselves out of that equation.
Yeah. That's fascinating. I really like the love's not enough thing, because again, from another area, but even in the DEI field, diversity, equity, inclusion, we talk about the difference between a good heart and actually good actions, right? Everybody says, oh, we should be doing this and this and this, but it's harder to actually take those actions that we're talking about. Is that the same thing in parenting? I mean, I imagine parents have really good intentions. I know I did, but then in the moment, things are happening, and it's really hard to, like you said, quit taking it personally. It's really hard to back away from some of that.
I think it is. I mean, I think there's this parallel with neurodiversity, which is another form of DEI. But I was thinking about, so I have 3 young adult children, 1 trans, and I remember having a conversation with them about, my husband and I were having a conversation about, this is hard for us. And their response was basically, I'm sorry, it's hard for you, but you got to deal with your stuff because this is my life, not yours. And it wasn't that callous, and it was part of a larger conversation. But on some level, that point was well made and reasonable, which is, Mom, Dad, go deal with your stuff. I get that this is hard, and this is where I am. And I think there are a lot of parallels in all kinds of aspects of DEI, is that sometimes we have to deal with our stuff, and it's not pretty.
Yeah.
We have to deal with our privilege, and it shows up in a lot of ways. Parents of neurotypical kids don't really see that they're parenting from a place of privilege, but they are, right? Because the world is designed for them and their kids.
Yeah, they're parenting from their own lived experience, and they don't necessarily have access or knowledge of all the different nuances, and their kids aren't exactly like them, so they have to learn those things, I would imagine.
Well, and they're parenting in a world that's designed for neurotypical people. So, the whole school gets a planner, and it might work great for their kids, but it might be terrible for our kids.
Yeah.
But our kids are expected to conform because that's what the norm uses. And there are a million examples of that, of ways that we need to understand the nuances of neurodiversity and of complex kids in order to meet them where they are and to create an environment that works for them, even if it's outside of the typical boxes that our kids are going to school in.
So we're really talking about equity there as opposed to equality, right? Not, you can't
Exactly.
have the same thing for every kid. They're not all in the center of the bell curve. So
No, it's everybody. I mean, when we look at accommodations, for example, for kids in a school environment, whether it's for ADHD or learning disabilities or anxiety, the whole point of the accommodations is to level the playing field, to bring that equity, because equal is not always equitable, right? Just because if you give them all the same thing, that may not actually be fair. You have to meet them where they are and meet the needs that they have. That creates a level field. But it's a nuanced conversation for sure.
and it's a tough one to get across, especially to some identity markers and groups. So describe
sure.
that a little bit more about, the difference between equality and equity. And equality is not always fair. On the surface, we say, oh, that's fair, everybody gets the same thing, but it isn't always fair. So describe that a little bit more. Because I know that some people really resist the idea of accommodations. Why should one kid have it easier than another? That's the way they put it.
This is not about easy. So I have a kid who has ADHD and dyslexia and anxiety. Okay. But let's look at just the dyslexia piece. So they have anxiety and ADHD that leads them to have more tendency to be distracted by noises in a classroom. And they've got a dyslexia piece that makes the language processing difficult. So let's look at standardized tests. If they're going to take a standardized test, they've got a dyslexia challenge that makes it hard for them to read here and then fill in the bubble over there, right? They've already got a visual processing challenge there, not to mention whether they can process the language of the question in the first place to get the correct answer. Then they've got to translate it over there. And they've got to manage distractions around it. And they've got to do it in a time efficient manner that's designed for someone who doesn't have those additional challenges. So if let's say we've got 3 minutes for this one question, is that fair? And if we give them both 3 minutes, is that equal? If one of them, they both have the same intellectual capacity, but one kid, it's going to take them 3 times as long to read the question and twice as long to find the right bubble on the other page. Is that really fair? No, but if we give her a little extra time, now we've changed it. It's no longer equal, but it's equitable, because if we give her 4 minutes and that person 3 minutes, we've accounted for the differences so that they can both reflect the intelligence. Does that
really
capture it?
Really good. You captured it exactly. I think that's a great way to look at it. I want to get to the discussion guide, but it occurred to me while you were talking, we all know there's bell curves and there's overlap, but ADHD, for example, expresses itself differently frequently in boys, right? They're the ones, Dennis DeMantis, are always in trouble and kicked out and all those kind of things. That has its problems. Girls kind of manifest a different ADHD. Correct me if I'm wrong, but inattentive and these different things, they tend to go home and do twice as much work on their homework. So they still get A's and B's, they get passed through, no one notices until they get to college frequently. It depends where they are. But then it starts to manifest in anxiety and depressive issues and all that, whereas boys, it's a different outcome. So discuss ADHD in girls. Yeah, I know it's a bell curve, but
So I was going to say, I might take a little issue with it's different in boys and girls, that default, but because hyperactivity and inattentive tend to be very different, and you're likely to have more hyperactivity in boys and often more inattentive than girls. But I have girls with hyperactive and inattentive. So I think what I would say is that we want to look at what's going on with the individual child, right? What happens with girls is that they're very often missed. And I think that the anxiety you described starts way earlier. For a lot of girls, they're getting treated for anxiety and the ADHD is getting missed, or the autism is getting missed, or whatever else is there, because girls are conditioned to please. Girls are conditioned to connect socially. And so they're getting a lot more training than boys are from a very, very early age to communicate more overtly. And so they tend to fly under the radar and tend to get missed unless they're really disruptive or bouncing off the walls, because they're just seen as anxious or a little shy or a little quiet or reserved, or but we don't see the other issues. I often say when ADHD is untreated, over time, if you can't get yourself to do what the world wants you to do, it's going to make you anxious. And then over time, that's going to make you depressed. So a lot of the coexisting nature of those conditions is because we haven't treated the underlying ADHD. Now, not completely, there's definitely coexisting, but very often it comes out of not having treated the ADHD in the first place. So if we identified a 5-year-old boy and a 5-year-old girl, and we identified the 5-year-old boy's ADHD and we start treating it, but the girl doesn't get identified or treated until 12, you're going to have all this anxiety that's had all this time to entrench itself because we weren't addressing the underlying issue in the first place, which was, I can't get myself to do what everybody's expecting of me. So I'm going to work harder, try harder, stress myself out. Because I remember when my kid was diagnosed about 8 years old, 7 years old with dyslexia, as well as some of these other issues. And I sat down and I said, sweetie, we now understand how your brain works and we're going to be able to help you do better in school. And she starts crying. She says, Mommy, I've been trying so hard. And she was trying so hard. But between the ADHD and the dyslexia, she had a double whammy. And it was really hard for her because she was trying to cover it, right? Because she was trying to please, because she had been conditioned, as girls tend to be, even if we try not to. They tend to be conditioned to please.
That's very insightful. Love that. It goes along with what I have already thought, but you just added a couple layers to it. So thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough one. And I want to say, girls have hyperactivity. Yes. I have hyperactivity. It is actually in many ways probably my superpower, because the reason I'm as committed and ambitious and successful as I've been is because I have the capacity to hyper focus and to act on it and to keep acting and working really hard, because I don't wear out as quickly as other people do. Yeah, no, I'm it's not lost on me. First of all, I know it's a bell curve, right? There's an overlapping bell curve for boys and girls. But no, I don't know if I consider my ADHD to be a superpower, but it does enable me to do things that I don't think I would be able to do without it. What I really like about it is all the other things that grow out of it. I mean, we could have anxiety and depression. Those certainly come out of mismanaged, but other things, I'm a really good crisis manager because I've put myself into so many of them. I'm pretty practiced. I say, okay, we got to calm down and figure this out. Do you know that 70% of ER docs are thought to have ADHD? I didn't know the number, but I wouldn't doubt it. It's not surprising because I often say, I know we can't multitask, but I think people with ADHD, particularly hyperactive type, are really good at what I call rapid sequential monotasking. Yeah. We can move back and forth super quick and be on it. And that doesn't mean we're multitasking, but we're, even though we might have trouble with bigger transitions, we can often transition thoughts quickly. And that's a gift. It is a gift. And I think our brains wake up in a crisis, right? They're kind of asleep a lot of the time, which is why medication can help and such. But when we're that's because the amygdala kicks up, right? And when we can rely on that to get stuff done, it's amazing. Yeah. It's kind of another little tangent, but I often say if there was a big problem on the 7th floor of a building and I'm on the 10th floor, put me in a room full of ADHD people, because I know they will calm down and the crisis will figure it out. People who have never had a bad hair day, I don't want to be around them. It's so true. So I do think maybe not fundamentally, but as an outgrowth, we become resilient. We become, just very persistent. I believe that we're very mission and purpose driven a lot, right? And I'm going to say those of us who are successful in managing it. Who find a path to be successful in managing it. There are a lot of people who are struggling in life, who are end up in and out of prison or unable to support themselves, or there's a lot of other, there is the dark side. If you don't figure out how to compensate or accommodate for yourself and manage it. Absolutely. And that's the challenge. Which is a big part of what your book is about.
to kind of
Yeah.
interrupt that in the stream somewhere. So
Yeah.
I was going to get to your discussion guide, but you just piqued my interest with one more thing.
Okay.
And that is this school to prison pipeline and the implicit bias. You know, part of it's racial, but also it's, you know, that's the kid that's always acting out. So that's the kid I'm going to punish harder. And kids don't get equally treated by their administrations, by their teachers, by their peers. And so talk a little bit about that.
So I have a theory, and this is just a theory, the world according to Elaine, that ADHD is what I call a judgment diagnosis. And that has not, a lot has changed in brain development and brain awareness in the last 30 years. Our understanding of autism has changed 180 degrees in the last 30 years. And there's a lot of compassion attached to that diagnosis. But what has not changed in the years I've been doing this work is that ADHD is still a judgment diagnosis. And it's still looked at as a behavioral problem. And if you adjust, and why can't you just, or why can't you get your kid to just, there's all of this stigma and shame that's still very much surrounding it. And so I think when you've got kids, when you're dealing with kids, yes, there's a racial bias. Yes, there's a socioeconomic bias, but I think there's also a behavioral bias that when you have a kid who doesn't know how to self-regulate, and the adults around them don't understand it and don't self-manage themselves and start judging this kid, and then the kid gets the self-concept, see, I am bad, it's not my behavior, it's me, and that's reinforced by the adults around them. You have this perpetuating cycle of judgment and shame and blame that becomes extraordinarily difficult to pull yourself out of. I mean, my husband at almost 60 years old is still struggling with the messaging that he got as a kid, because, you know, super smart kid who wasn't, you know, falling in line. There was a lot of judgment that came around that.
Absolutely. I just a little story for myself, but I think we get typecast. And I think maybe that's a little bit about what you're talking about. I was in I could barely get better than C's in school the whole time until I got to college. Things got a little bit better because I could chart my own path. But I remember being in high school history, I think it was 10th grade, US history or something. And I had a friend who always got A's and I always got C's. And one day, just stupid ADHD, say, let's trade. You know, you're going to get an A in the class no matter what. Here's my paper. Put it in your handwriting. Give me your paper. We turned in papers. I got a C. Yeah. On his paper.
Right. That's right, because that was the expectation. That's right. Yeah. And that's the implicit bias. That's what happens when the adults start seeing the kid as bad, the kids start seeing themselves, then they start performing, then we have expectations, and we don't want to believe that that's there. And you know, teachers don't want to believe that that's there, and they're not doing it on purpose.
No, they're not.
But there is a way in which, you know, we call forth and we get what we ask for. And if we don't expect much from kids, we're very often not going to get it. Or if we expect it in a way that comes from a place of judgment instead of empowerment. And that's really what I think, you know, this coach approach is about, and the book is about, is how do we call these kids forth to want to achieve their potential, and for them to see it as valuable to them, for them to see what's in it for them, instead of like judging them or setting the bar so high that they're never going to be able to hit it because we're not helping them hit the incremental steps along the way.
Yeah. Love that whole thing. Yeah. I think that a little bit like you had a book inside of you and it had to come out. I think kids have a book inside of them and we need to let it come out. Otherwise we kind of squelch it and we come up with all kinds of other.
Yeah. And whatever it is, I often say, Rick, that these kids, that the kids with complex issues, whether it's ADHD or any of the related stuff around it, a lot of times, not all the time, but most of these kids are living in a generalist's world. And if we can recognize their expertise, if we can play to their gift and their genius instead of only focusing on their challenge and their disability or their whatever you want to call it, if we can help them see what they are good at that's the game changer, right? Because they are specialists in a generalist world, and we have to help them figure out what their specialty is. In my eldest kid, we figured out really young what their specialty was, and it made all the difference in the world. But it was quite by accident. Like it wasn't like we were looking for it. I just knew that there was so much negative feedback that anytime that there was some positive opportunity for them to be successful, I was going to do everything I could to set them up for success, because the success is going to breed more success. And that, playing to that strength, turned out to be the game changer for them in their life, and for all of my kids, actually.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
It's impressive. Last thing, let's talk about this discussion guide, because I think that
Okay.
might be a really good, even though it's in the back of the book, it seems like maybe people should maybe start with that a little bit and review that before they read the book. What do you think?
Well, you can. I remember I told you there was this book that I loved, Wendy Mogul's book. And so she had a discussion guide in the back of her book. And I was like, okay, I'm going to put a discussion guide in the back of this book. I want people to talk about it. I want teachers to talk about it, parents to have discussions about it. And the way the book is framed, so the book is called The Essential Guide to Raising Complex Kids. And it really is coaching skills. It's coaching tools, concepts, and skills with a neurodiversity map on it, with an executive function lens on it, if you will. And so the whole first section of the book is really just kind of understanding what's going on and getting a framework for what happens when you have kids with these complex issues. And then the second part of the book, and the last couple of sections of the book, are about, okay, so what's the model? How do you manage it? How do you use coaching skills to learn to manage whatever complex issues are coming up? And so the discussion guide is divided. The first 6 chapters are in section 1, because that's the whole first section of the book. And then the rest of it is breaking it down into the 4 cornerstones of our model, which are activating the brain, positivity, shifting expectations, and using systems and structures effectively. So those are 4 sections that you would talk about. And then in the last section, you kind of pull it all together again. So it's really designed to set the framework, go through the 4 cornerstones of the model, and then wrap it up in a manner of speaking, putting it all together.
Yep. Really looking forward to reviewing this book and reading it again, and then doing the book club. I think people are really going to enjoy it, for one thing. And I'm sure in our community, a lot of people with ADHD, and as you know, there's a lot of comorbid issues going on too. So, and a lot of us, such as myself, we found out about our ADHD because one of our kids was struggling, right? And then we said, in my case, I just said, that's my life 34 years removed, right?
Yep, me as well. Well, the 2 other things I want to say about the book. One is that you can read it, or it's also voiced by my eldest child, who's an actor. So you can listen to it on Audible. And the best compliment I got about the book was from my daughter-in-law, who read the book and said, I feel like I'm using it to parent myself. So the goal of the book, it really is a model for managing ADHD. And so whether you're using it for yourself, or using it as a parent, or using it as a professional, whatever lens you're using, the secret is that what it's teaching you is coaching skills, but it's doing it in a very conversational way. So it's done through stories. You're going to feel like you're sitting down having coffee with me. And it's designed to help you pull it in and use it. It's not highly theoretical. It's really designed to be actionable.
Cool. So I'm up against the clock. You probably are too, but give us just a minute or 2 about your coaching practice. What makes you different as a coach, and what's the profile of someone who would be benefiting most from you?
So the company that I represent, that I lead, that I run, is called impactparents.com. And I think what makes us different as coaches is that we are coaches first, with an expertise and a training in neurodiversity and executive function. So we're not coming out of the ADHD coaching realm, which is very ADHD specific. We were trained, all of us are trained certified coaches first, and then got an additional education on top of that. So it's a very classic coaching approach. And coaching is an empowerment-based method for lasting change. And so it lends itself really, really well to people with all kinds of neurodiversity. It's very non-judgmental. It's very empowering. And so in that case, in that respect, we're probably not that different from a lot of other coaches, except for we've been doing it a long time. And we've worked with thousands of parents all over the world and really know what doesn't work. And the feedback we get from parents a lot is they've tried everything and nothing worked. And this is the first thing they've ever tried after 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, that's finally helping them and working. So it's a really effective method, any coaching, wherever you go. For me and my own personal work, as I say, I've got a team of coaches that works with parents. I do a lot of work with executives who are typically also parents struggling with complex kids. And I do a lot of work with what I've begun to call very complex kids. So kids with multiple diagnoses. Maybe it's parents who have kids in treatment centers or who they're afraid they're going to end up in treatment centers or wilderness programs, really dealing with super complex circumstances where maybe they haven't engaged as a parent in a constructive way early enough. And so we're coming back and trying to help them reestablish trust and relationship with their kids to be able to cultivate this kind of ownership, which is ultimately what this is all about, is understanding our kids well enough to help them understand themselves well enough to help them learn to manage themselves. That's our job, is to put ourselves out of a job. And that's what we try to do. And we try to do it in a very gentle way. So there's some training and group coaching and private coaching, depending on what people are looking for. But it all starts with training with what we call Sanity School, but a way to begin to understand these coaching skills so that parents can use them immediately in their lives.
Fascinating. I love all that description. And we really have to do, but you've got one more thing that you triggered in my mind. A lot of times people ask me, do I need a coach or do I need a therapist? Do I need both? Just delineate that. What's the difference? The fundamental differences between therapy and coaching. Is there a line? Does it get blurred?
Here's my favorite story, and not everybody's going to agree with me, but my way of looking at it is this. If you come to me as an adult and you say, I never learned to ride a bike, I want to learn to ride a bike. A consultant is going to get on a bike and ride the bike and say, here's how you ride a bike. And a therapist is going to say, well, let's talk about why you never learned to ride a bike. What might be interfering with you riding a bike? And the coach is going to hold the bike and say, climb on and run along beside you and help you practice riding the bike until you learn to ride the bike. Now, sometimes there may be some, deep-seated fear and obstacle that you need some therapy to help you figure out why you didn't ride a bike. But sometimes you just need someone to hold the bike steady and run along beside you while you figure it out. And so I would say that in the realm of ADHD, the research is pretty clear that therapy isn't going to help you or manage your ADHD for the most part. It's not going to help you organize a kid's backpack. It's not going to, it's going to help you deal with the emotional fallout that comes from having had unmanaged ADHD, right? It's going to help you deal with the anxiety or the depression that may be correlating with it. But the management of ADHD lends itself really well to coaching because it's about conscious management. It's about looking at the challenge, understanding what's underneath it, and coming up with trying different ways to address it until you get something that works, and then repeating, rinse and repeat. And so the research is pretty clear that coaching is a very effective modality for creating lasting change, which is what we want to do with ADHD management. And that therapy works a little bit more in that emotional realm, but doesn't tend to work as well in the more tactical, logistical realm, especially for kids.
Okay. Sorry, my screen got wonky on me here, but we're all set. I think this is a great interview. I don't think there's going to be much for them to edit. They'll just edit me out, but I think you did great.
Super. Well, it's truly a pleasure. I'm really honored, and thank you for doing it. Very much. I think I really want to get this book back out into the world. It came out in the middle of COVID, and I don't think it really had the chance to get the attention that it needs, because there are people out there who need it a lot. And
well, that's certainly a time frame concern. Your kid's 5 years old once, right? 6 years.
That's right. Or 12 or 20. Like, we work with lots of parents of young adults. So it's really for parents of kids of all ages.
Yeah, there's a certain urgency there. Okay, well, I appreciate it, Elaine. We will
You as
get
well.
that out, and we're really looking forward to reviewing the book. Yeah.
Thanks,
Thank-
Rick. I so appreciate